Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be venturing to the middle of nowhere, so I hope you grabbed your flashlights, get comfortable, and let the darkness take control. I was out camping with my friend Josiah in the mountains of Pennsylvania. It was the weird in-between season after winter, but before spring really kicks off. There were still no leaves on the trees, but the day of hiking to the camping spot was about 60 degrees. I bought a small rifle as we wanted to do some plinking while we were out. We set up the camp at about 3 p.m, leaving plenty of time for shooting. Just two buddies with guns out in the middle of the mountains. It was an incredible day. Night began to fall upon us, the air started to chill, and we built a fire for the night. Breaking out the bourbon, we talked about everything from future plans, girlfriends, and how society sucks. Josiah was used to camping, an industrious guy who had a passion for the outdoors, but to put it kindly, was not the smartest person I've ever met. From across the mountain, we could begin to hear coyotes. This is common when camping in Pennsylvania. Something you should know about coyotes is that they are incredibly noisy, and you can hear them from miles away. They are completely terrified of people, and therefore not a danger in the slightest. Or so I thought. The coyote calls were getting closer. Fine, we thought, as they were probably just using the trails to move more efficiently between the mountain peaks. This comfort in logic dissolved over the next hour or two as the chilling howls kept getting closer. Josiah casually mentioned that the coyotes are close, but he and I both knew they were actively avoiding us. Shortly after he said this, the call stopped and we were in complete silence. The pops and flickers of the dying campfire were our only indication that time itself hadn't frozen. That's when the bushes behind us began to rustle. Grabbing my flashlight, I scanned the woods around Josiah and me, only to catch the reflection of about half a dozen set of eyes in a circle around us. We both realize what is happening at the same time. Josiah grabs the rifle, hands it to me, and in return I hand him the flashlight. I slowly chamber around into the semi-automatic .22 caliber rifle, realizing that I probably don't have enough firepower to stop all of these coyotes should the situation escalate. Josiah and I stand with our backs towards the fire, him using the light to illuminate each coyote, the moment they break a twig underneath their movement. The coyotes, once illuminated, let out a bark, then move behind a tree. It appears as if hunting us is a game to them, as we stand there playing this game of high-stakes flashlight tag with a rifle. I come to presume that these dogs are just coming out of a very harsh winter and are probably starved. The standoff lasts for hours. Just as quickly as they surrounded us, they vanished into the darkness of the forest, only to resume their hunting calls on other mountains. I slept with a rifle that night. To this day, I still don't know why a typically harmless animal made us fight for our lives that night. The next morning, the situation didn't get any better. Central Pennsylvania has odd weather snaps. The day before, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This morning, there were about 3 inches of snow on the ground, temperatures were below 10 degrees, and heavy snowstorms rolling in. This was uncalled for by every weather agency I checked before we set out on this adventure. We packed for temperatures as low as 30, but not this tundra. Hands were bright red, dexterity lost, and I've been cold before, but this was the first time I was cold and unprepared enough to worry. Forget cooking breakfast. We needed to get out of there before the snow picked up. We tore down the tents, put on as many layers as possible, stretching shirts over shirts, packing bags, and cleaning the site in less than an hour. We make our way down the war trophy mountain that we battled for the night prior, but the trails below are covered by unpacked snow. We were going to have to use map and compass. We were also going to have to trailblaze through more difficult terrain if we wanted to make it to the car. We find a felled tree, lay out the map in the quickly accumulating snow and try to orient ourselves. If you've never been cold, hungry, and most likely dehydrated while trying to identify mountain peaks and where they correspond on a map, then let me be the first to tell you that it is an aggravating experience where any decision could mean the difference between living and dying. We find 3 identifiable peaks, see the creek that we crossed in the previous morning, and have a plan to get through the 5 miles as quickly as possible in a straight shot. This wasn't a typical hiking pace. We were just short of jogging, both to keep body temperature up and to expedite the trek until we could get into my used sedan view and pray that the heat worked. 4 inches of snow were now weighing down our footsteps. As we approached the creek, we remembered that the bridge we crossed before was another 3 miles out of our way, a distance we were unwilling to add to our already freezing bodies. That was only just beginning to freeze, but quickly. Josiah heads northwest along the riverbank to look for a method of crossing. I direct myself southwest to do the same. The instructions were to not walk for more than 200 meters away from the central location, so that we could still hear each other calling that a solution was found. Within minutes, Josiah calls. A tree had fallen over the creek that offered about 3 feet of clearance above the hypothermic waters, and I offered to cross first. Straddling this tree, I slide myself over the waters rushing below me, mistakenly seeing my pocket knife fall out of my pocket into those same waters. A mild inconvenience in any other situation would be the loss of a necessary tool for getting out of this occasion. I crossed the river, choosing that creek bed to be the resting place for the knife. Josiah crosses after, clumsier than myself. His foot dips slightly into the creek, dampening his sock. Our time to now get into the car is now cut into minutes, if we do not get his foot warmed. We sit down, take his boots off, take off his socks, and the cold winter and snow must have felt like knives against his skin. With our reduced movement of our cold fingers, I'm helping him find a fresh pair of socks in my pack, as he was wearing his last 2 pairs. Socks are something I always bring in quantity on these trips. I find the socks. Josiah puts them on, struggles to put on his boot, and we eventually begin our voyage again. We traverse the last few miles of the wilderness and make our way back to the SUV. At this point, we are nearly running towards the vehicle. There are 5 inches of snow. I unlock the door, dump our packs in the back, and turn the key. The car revs, and the sound of the engine roaring over the snow was like the cries of victory we deserved. We kept the car in park, pushed on the gas to rev the engine up to about 2,000, heating up the cabin for the 2 of us. We could finally feel our fingers and our toes. Driving back over the mountain, listening to the radio weather forecasts, mocking us by their explanations of how serious this unforeseen storm is, and that school districts all over the county are already closing for the following Monday. We get back to my farmhouse, heat up coffee, make eggs, and laugh about how we nearly perished twice in the last 48 hours. After breakfast, after nearly dying, Josiah drives home. Camping is about challenging yourself and reconnecting to what mankind once was, with some added amenities. That trip was far more than the challenge either of us had in mind, but it added confidence to our ability to work together in bad situations. I do mineral exploration in Alaska. I'm often transported by helicopter to remote regions throughout the already remote state. A few years ago, my field partner and I came across what seemed like a bear kill of a caribou carcass. But when we got closer, it seemed odd. The only thing that remained were 2 spines and 1 head. The head was arranged such that the mouth was wide open, pointing up like it was screaming towards the heavens. The eyes were cut out. Very weird. There's also been many instances of coming across old minor buildings littered with dog skeletons, or having strangely new children's clothes thrown about. I was about 14 years old when my dad went away on business for a few weeks, leaving me to tend to the farm by myself. Mostly just feeding horses and chickens, not a big deal. The farm was way outside of town, and down a dirt road. The nearest neighbors were 2 pastures away, and my dad insisting on never locking the doors. The farm was always seriously eerie in the mornings. After the first few nights, I started hearing tapping on the windows late at night, so I obviously broke Dad's rules and started locking the front and back doors. Then the window tapping advanced to doorknob rattling, and then I started finding odd things around the farm while doing the chores. One morning, I found the horses stuffing themselves in all the hay storage stall. The latch for that stall was very stiff and a little complicated, so it had obviously been opened by a person, not the horses. The worst morning, I stepped out onto the back porch to find all the chickens sitting in a row along the side of a shed, evenly spaced, with their necks broken. 1 or 2 of them were still moving a bit. They looked set out on display. The chicken yard latch had obviously been opened by a person and left open. The worst part was when my dad finally came home, he blamed me for every bit of the oddness and disaster, and acted like I was stupid for being scared. He insisted that the horses opened the hay latch, and that the dogs were responsible for opening the chicken yard and the line of poised, broken-necked chickens. I think it's worth mentioning that our next-door neighbor was well known for being absolutely mental. Documented bits of crazy that my dad was entirely aware of included putting bear traps in his haystacks to catch the kids who had been playing with it, and blocking off a neighbor's driveway with a load of dirt as revenge for not letting him ride his horses on their property. So my guess is that our neighbor knew that my dad was gone because his vehicle wasn't present, could hear my music turned up in the distance across the pastures, and figured terrorizing a middle school girl would be a fun hobby for a few weeks. This didn't happen to me, but my boyfriend and his cousin. They were 17 and driving down this really dark road in a southwestern part of Arizona. It's a long stretch of road that was well known for not having any street lights, and it was surrounded by the local farmer's field. It had a huge canal that ran along the side of the street. There was also a very small town that connected to the west side of the streets to the south side of the streets, and it was named Santa Maria. Now my husband and I, who were both born and raised in Arizona, grew up close to this area. We'd heard about all the crazy stories and strange happenings, but crazy stories is all that we believed them to be. Especially because we drove up and down through this street almost every day, definitely every weekend, and always with our family as youngsters, then as teenagers looking for a spot to party or make out at. So with that being said, I just want to say I don't condone underage drinking. We were young and dumb, but now I'm a mum. Anyway, on this night my boyfriend and his cousin were sober. They had just left the south side and were now heading home. They were on the 67th Avenue and Lower Buckeye going west to 75th and Thomas Road when the car in front of them swerved crazily, and there wasn't any heavy traffic, but there was a car in front of them and one in the back. When the car in front of them swerved to the right, this is what they described. A lady in a white gown and a veil with no face was floating towards them. The cousin screamed to hit it. My boyfriend hit the gas fast, swerving to the right, causing them to almost crash into the canal. Neither of them looked back behind them into the mirrors. Then they sped all the way home, not saying a word. When they pulled into the driveway, his cousin jumped out the truck and ran inside, leaving him behind, and the passenger door swung wide open before he even put the truck in park. My boyfriend then ran inside too, frightened by what he'd just seen. They were both too scared to go out and check the bed of the truck or even go to close the door. To better understand, where we live there have been accounts of people seeing La Llorona, which is apparently what they think they've seen. Bear in mind I've been married to this man for over 20 years. He's a straight up guy and has only shared this story with me on several occasions. Each time I curiously ask what I think he saw, and he stares at me quietly and says, "Well, she was floating, because I didn't see her feet," which then tells me she probably wasn't human. I just want to let you know these guys aren't remotely cowardly, but something on that road scared the hell out of them. I worked in a kennels up in the mountains. In the depths of winter, it would be dark by 5 p.m. I'd be in the office finishing up some paperwork. At this stage, everyone would be gone, and this particular building was a bit far away from the main building and car park. All the dogs would be sleeping by this time after a busy day. You could hear a pin drop. Sometimes, I would hear definite, slow footsteps, so much so that I would get up, come out to the main front, ready to explain that we were closed but no one would be there. It used to freak me out. A few times I would even check the dogs in case it was coming from the kennels, but they were all sound asleep. I used to own a horse boarding and training farm with about 45 acres surrounded by woods. I used to spend the night there quite a bit because I had to start chores early in the morning, so if I stayed up too late, it wasn't worth it to drive home. One night at about midnight, my dog started to bristle up and growl at the door of the office I slept in, and then my iPod, which I kept on a speaker in the middle of the barn, started blasting out Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire at full volume, which I definitely had not left on. Let me tell you, that song is freaky as hell in the middle of the night. Like wet your pants freaky. My dog was full on growling and barking at the door, so I cracked it to let him run out, figuring that if someone were in or around the barn, he'd get them. Anyone there would have had to have been trespassing at that time of night. After a few minutes, I went out of the office into the barn aisle with the bat to turn off the creepy music. The light I usually kept on so that I could see around was off, so it was pitch black in most of the barn. My dog was staring out the barn door, which I kept open in the summer to keep the horses cooler, as his hair bristled but wasn't leaving the barn, which he was allowed to do. I wrote it off as creepy as hell, but ultimately just was one of those things. You know, like it's weird and I can't explain it, but there's got to be a rational explanation that I simply don't know what it is. But the real scary part is that my property shared a private gate in the back with the property closest to mine, which had a gate at the back. Most of my property was fenced because of the horses, and the property next to mine was dozens of acres fenced with a chain link fence, which, if you know anything about rural fencing, is not done. Anyway, we found out later that the owner of the adjoining property was Todd Colap, the South Carolina serial killer. He had a woman chained up like a dog on his property, who he and his friends would abuse and walk around the property on a leash. He also had some of the remains of the people he buried on his property. He was doing all that stuff while I lived next to him. In fact, I used to ride on his property, but would always turn around if I heard machinery. In retrospect, it was probably burying things, or got the creeps, like something would tell me to turn around and go home. I was probably one of the few, if not only person beside his friends, to go on his property while all of that was going on. I was a field geologist in the outback, about 12 hours north of Adelaide. one day I was driving the truck and saw what looked like a flagpole sticking up in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't anywhere near a farm or anywhere else that people would be, so I decided to drive over and check it out. It was a dead dog fully impaled on a spike, like from butt to mouth. Took some pictures and had my boss call the cops, but for the rest of the assignment I was freaked out that some maniac was out there with me. I spent a summer doing conservation work, out in the absolute middle of nowhere. I was part of a crew that would spend 2 weeks camping in remote places to do manual labor in places machines couldn't get to. We were building a new hiking/biking trail in the back portion of a designated wilderness area in a high-altitude desert. This means that the nearest civilization was a 2-hour car ride to a town of 41 people in a sandy soil area where tracks last forever. It was in the middle of our stint during the early part of the night, where everyone else had gone to bed, but I stayed up to read. It must have been around 11:30 or so, still pitch black outside, with clouds having covered the stars. My headlamp was probably the only light on a 40-mile radius. Suddenly, I hear footsteps walking around our camp, and head towards the tents from where I was in the community tent. The sound immediately put me on edge, as I felt the hair on my arms raise and my adrenaline spike. I recall thinking to myself that 2 things are very wrong, since the person was not using a light to see, and the footsteps were not coming towards me from the tents. Rather, it was the opposite. Within the 4 seconds it took me to drop my book, get up, and turn the corner of the tent to cast my light on the sleeping tents, the sound had stopped, but I saw tracks in the dirt before me. It looked like they came from one end of camp, looked in my tent, walked through the sleeping tents, and kept going again out of camp. I don't know if I was making too much noise or not by walking around, but the rest of my crew ended up waking up and asking me what was going on from inside their tents. After explaining what I found, they all got up to look at the boot prints in the dirt. They were damn near perfect copies of my own boots, except for one small thing. I had a rock stuck in my treads that were messing up the symmetry. I was wearing fairly common work boots, except I also happened to wear US size 15 double wide, so there's no way in hell this was one of the other crew members. I don't think any of us slept much that night. Never saw or heard anything more after the night. A light rain removed the tracks a few days later, but I do remember none of us were willing to step on the prints themselves and chose to step over them like cracks in the sidewalk. I once had an encounter with the trailside killer in Northern California in the late 70s while I was hiking with a friend. I came across him at a rocky outcrop on Mount Tam. He gave off a very discomforting vibe, and we didn't hang around. The encounter was short. We attempted to exchange a few pleasantries, as one does when seeing someone at a good resting spot. But it was weird, and the entire thing felt off. So my buddy and I opted to keep walking, and we did. We just got the wrong vibes from that guy. But strange enough that it stuck with both of us. That was until a few years later, and his picture shows up in the paper. If I'd have been with my girlfriend, we may not have made it out of there alive. Who knows? One time I was walking my dog with my friend, who says that he could see spirits around some cliffs, and we took an overgrown trail and there was a bunny hole. My dog stopped, stared at it, then booked it. We then heard metallic screeching sounds coming from that hole, and a feeling of wrongness came over me. My friend freaked the hell out and legged it. I ran too. When we got home, my dog was shivering, and looked out the window, and my friend and I still haven't figured out what it was. Days later, there was a landslide there, collapsing the cliff and probably killing or destroying whatever it was hiding in there. Perhaps we'll never know. I was camping in Florida on the Appalachian Trail. I was approached by a group of inbred-looking men who started shouting at me. At first, I couldn't understand what they were saying, but as my brain slowly processed, did I understand the following. "We could gut ya, and nobody heard you scream," and started pointing their rifles at me. I took off in the swamp and heard gunshots behind me, and they genuinely seemed disappointed that they missed. I don't camp alone, nor unarmed, anymore. I was hiking in a state park with a friend once, about a half-mile away from the trail, and 5 miles from the trail's start. That's where we found a woman's blouse, some jeans that were ripped from the zipper to the crotch, and a pair of underwear. It all looked super dirty, like it had been there for a really long time. It really freaked me out, especially because it wasn't the type of clothes you would wear for a few miles hike. We reported it to the ranger station, and they said they would check it out, but I'm not sure if they ever did. When I got home, I looked for any crimes in the area in the past couple of years, but couldn't find anything. I haven't been back to those woods without a group since. Who knows? There could be some darker secret still lurking in that woods, waiting to be discovered. I am an avid hunter in a rural town in Missouri. My family hunts on public land, and we have hunted on the same ridge for multiple generations. The land used to be kept by a large sawmill that used mules to drag the trees to the mill in the nearby town. We have found all sorts of crazy stuff: railroad spikes in the middle of the woods, horseshoes grown into the side of trees where they hung it on a limb. One of the craziest things I found in the woods was where a wagon had fallen off the side of a ridge, taking the mules with it. It's something like a 200-foot drop, so they just left everything down there. I've hiked by this thing hundreds of times, and from our hunting spot, the woods all rotted from it, but the metal brackets and wheels were still there, grown over and taken back by nature. One day while walking in the woods, I get to my spot that's probably half a mile from that spot that I've been sitting for the past few hours, when I hear what sounds like people yelling down the ridge, followed by a loud scream and a huge crashing sound. So I grabbed my gear and started to make my way out. When I get to where the wagon debris was, there was a flower wreath laid over the wagon, but I've never seen anyone down there except my family members, and no one knows who might have put it there. We talked about that night back at camp, and we could only assume that if someone had passed in that wagon, maybe it was some distant grandchild or something, and that day was the anniversary of it happening. But that still doesn't explain the sound that I heard. I'm still hunting in the same place, but I've never heard or seen anything since. My dad and I were hunting in the Poconos, so me and my dad were sitting in a hunting tower. It was cold as hell, and we start hearing what sounded like one of those old religious chants where they all sing together in Latin while walking in a straight line. It kept getting closer till we saw movement about 20 meters ahead, and then we saw a group of about 10 to 30 people, all in white holding candles, and then about 5 more people with rifles and shotguns standing in the front and back on the sides. We let them pass, and they were staring at us as they walked by, but it was scary as hell. About 10 minutes after they walked by, we went over to where they were standing. It was snowy out there, and there were 0 footsteps in the snow, and to this day we still don't even know what the hell we saw. In middle school, I worked at the school during the summer, doing general painting and helping the maintenance guys. We had to drive out to the middle of the Floridian forest to pick up some pine lumber for the gym's new bleachers. And when we got to the mill at 7 a.m, the whole place was locked down with police. They had found gasoline cans and pill bottles out in one of the farm groves, telltale signs of kids abusing substances, but supposedly the cops were there because they found human remains. I was pretty young and don't remember anything outside of my little kid point of view, but I remember seeing dark streaks of blood running up the trunks of several pines. I've since learned from the guys I was with then that a teenager had his life ended by a bear after attacking it, and the blood was either from the wounded bear climbing a tree or dragging a hurt person up with it. But I'm sure you can agree with me that bears don't do that, and I can't see an injured bear making up several pines in a row while bleeding to that. So technically I saw a creepy thing while working in a remote area. Look up Lakeland Mill casualties or something to find it. The story of the kids passing was in the local paper. I fly helicopters over power lines in remote parts of the country. I once saw what I thought was a human leg sticking out of the woods in a very small clearing in the trees. It shook me enough that I went back to the location and got some of the ground crewmen to go back and look while I hovered as low as I could without hitting the rotors on the trees. When we get there, he says he can't exactly see what it is. We go back and grab a pair of binoculars so that he can get a closer look. Turns out it was a cow. The catch was that it had no skin, none at all. A perfect cow without any of its skin. No animal had eaten it yet, so it was still fully intact. There were no farms around for a 50-mile radius, and I still have no clue how it ended up there in the manner that it was. I still remember the, geez, that's a body, feeling I had when I think of this story. I used to work for an IT company in the gaming industry, whose office was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by farms and forest. One day, one of the development team had come in from a walk in the forest and was visibly upset. Turns out she came across a dead fox. The thing that was concerning is that she said it was hanging from a tree and looked like it was put there on purpose. So a bit later on, a few of us went down to have a look. We came across a small clearing with the dead fox hanging there. Upon closer inspection, we realized it had been hung by its neck, with an incision from its balls to its throat, and all of its insides had been pulled out. We felt pretty sick from that one. We got it down from the branch and chucked it into the bushes away from the path and clearing. Still to this day, I have no idea why or how it was in that state. This was when I was about 13. I was at church camp, which had a cliff nearby. Of course, my two tent mates and I snuck out during the middle of the night to go see the stars. It was a magnificent view. We were all from the city, so being in the middle of the forest was exciting, since we couldn't see many stars at home. So we hiked the mile to the cliff and stand there for a few minutes in silence. Across the valley, I see a light on the mountain. I assumed it was a car because it was going sideways, like it was on a road, but then it started to go straight down the mountain, which would have been impossible for a car because no roads go straight down it. The light started to speed up and was heading right towards us. The light made it to the bottom of the huge mountain within 2 to 3 minutes. It must have been going at least 70 miles per hour. We all stood our ground, not saying a word. When it got to the valley, it went even faster and was still coming right towards us. We saw it still only had one massive light instead of two like a car, and it was huge. I don't think a dirt bike could have had that big of a light, even in the dark. The moon was so bright you could have gotten away with no headlights. We finally ran when it got 3/4 of the way across the valley. It was strangely terrifying. Once the light appeared there was a heavy feeling of horror that we only spoke about once. One friend thought it was so scary, she pushed us down to get by us while we were running up the hill on our way to camp. In the morning we told the grown-ups about it and they didn't really believe us. One said there was a sighting of a strange man who was snooping around, so the light was a warning to get back to camp. I suppose being a mile away in the dark as 13-year-olds is pretty dangerous. I don't believe in ghosts and spirits, and it could have just been a dirt bike or something, but I haven't felt that amount of terror since. I was in Southeast Alaska for around 15 days a few summers ago. We had just finished up dinner and washed out our pots and pans and had gone into our respective tents in the trees along the shore that we had stopped at for the night. The spot we had chosen to camp at wasn't ideal. The tide was set to come in pretty far that night and would only leave us with a few feet before the water would be lapping up at our tent flaps. But we also didn't care that much as it had been raining and incredibly windy that day, so kayaking was hardly any fun at all, and we needed to stop. About 45 minutes after we said goodnight to one another, I heard some splashing in the tidal zone, probably 20 feet from my tent. I didn't think much of it because a few times before, when in Alaska, we had stopped at beaches where the tide had risen within a few feet of our tents. I tried to ignore it, although in my mind I'm freaking out. Our camp spot was less than ideal if you wanted to escape in the middle of the night. We were at the base of a relatively steep hill that was covered in alders and slick with rain. To the left, probably 70 feet of where we camped, there was a rocky outcrop that went out into the water and was about 20 feet tall and steep enough that you couldn't climb it. For example, a grizzly bear, and there were lots out in the summer, we had seen 4 or 5 times that day alone patrolling the beaches. It wanted to see what was going on down the beach and walk towards us from the right, and it would basically seal off our movement, sort of like putting the cork back in a wine bottle. Not many places to go. After 15 minutes of hearing splashing, I start to try and rationalize, enough to go to sleep. But that's when I start hearing something other than splashing. This incredibly high-pitched gargling sound breaks through the night's relatively quiet air. It sounded as though 2 cats had gotten into a fight, but every time they let out a scream, the other cat would push one cat's head underwater. This went on for a good 20 minutes. After it died down, I hear, "That's weird, huh?" from the other tent, obviously trying to downplay the incident. I, being scared as hell, just reply, "Yep, gonna sleep." 15 minutes pass without as much of a sound, but then the same gargling breaks through the night, this time much closer. The noises are deeper this time, more guttural. It sounds like an old man fighting with a cat, and each time each of them shriek, they are forced underwater. The splashing intensifies, and it sounds like it's coming from right outside my tent. I think that the fear of whatever was going on eventually just zapped me of all my energy, because eventually I fell asleep. I just remember that I didn't move a muscle, and I didn't move for so long that all of my muscles ached after a while, and I could feel my heart beat in my throat all night long. We woke up, had breakfast, broke down the tents, and got back on the road. Didn't hear it ever again. A few weeks later I did some Googling, and I'm pretty sure it was just sea otters fighting each other in the intertidal zone, but it was scary as hell. I grew up on a farm, and in high school I used to mess with my friends by hiding and making them find me. One night, my friend was over and we were waiting on this other guy. We see him pull up, so we take off running to hide. It's funny because they have to wander around somewhere they're unfamiliar with, or go ask my parents and be told, "Too bad, you'll have to find her." It's like a forced hide and seek. Anyway, this one night, my friend hid in one of the buildings while I ran for the trees. I was hiding under some bushes and heard breathing, like human breathing. There were no animals about, and it creeped me out so bad I ran out of the hiding to greet my friend. I felt so uncomfortable for the rest of the night. Sometime during the night, my dad heard something and went out to investigate. In the morning, he discovered that one of our cows was killed and butchered. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories. Please do not forget to follow me on Twitter and Instagram because I'm asking you to, and it'll help you out in future, I guarantee it. I do hope this video makes it to the 40-minute mark. I think there are a fair few edits, and there are a number of shorter stories in here. You see, a while ago, maybe over a year ago now, I was reached out to by Amino to work with them and upload to there. And because of their limitations, I had to find lots of short stories, really small ones, to put on their platform. And I tried it for a while, but just didn't like it. It's too much effort to be creating content on multiple platforms at once, especially one where I hardly got any retention. Also, I found it really hard to understand. I mean, I'm not sure why. I just found it a bit confusing, really. So I opted out and chose not to stick around, but I still had all these stories that I'd gathered for the purpose of uploading on there but had never used, so I thought, you know what? Better start using up these really short stories. So you might get a few more in upcoming videos from time to time. Well, I think I'm going to head off now. Stay awesome.